Thank you, and good evening, everyone. First thing I want to say is thank you, everyone, for joining us here, especially you students. You are our future. You are a lot of the reason we do everything that we do, and we appreciate so much that you're taking time to attend this very important discussion. The second thank you I want to say is to our partners at the Institute. This is a team unparalleled in my experience. They make us look fantastic. We show up and this stuff just looks like magic. And it really is a pleasure to work with everybody here on this team. The Project on Accountable Justice is a new partnership of several universities, as you heard. Our mission is fairly simple: to advance public safety through evidence-based policies and practices in Florida and beyond. And beyond is a unique sort of addition because we know that everything that happens in Florida is watched all over the country. And as you'll hear from some of our colleagues up on the panel, Florida is a very pivotal state, and we're also at a very pivotal moment in our history, particularly in terms of how we handle our justice reform issues. We are right on the cusp of really doing some tremendous things in the state, but the difficulty in translating what we know works in policy and practice on paper and actually implementing in the community is a great challenge. And that connection that we have in our work with the community around the Institute and our other partners is essential in making it happen. And to hear your voices and to hear your opinions means so much to the work that we're doing. And believe me, everything that you say and all the questions that you ask, we are very respectful of and are weaving into our own agenda, and the policies that come forward are going to be the result of these tremendous gatherings. So the opportunity that we have tonight is a very, very near and dear to my heart. I'm a mom. I actually have raised 7 children. I'm still raising a couple of them. But I had one child who got caught up in the system, and his name is Brian. Brian is the sweetest kid you'll ever meet, but Brian ran into trouble early in his adolescence and actually ended up cycling pretty deeply into the system, wherein he learned very quickly how to tattoo the left side of his arm. That was the best skill that he had. This sort of gave me the impetus to focus on kids and to really, in a policy context, there's nothing we can do more than what we can do for our children. This is the most compelling piece of work that we do at the Project on Accountable Justice, and I just am so pleased to see people interested in it, and thank you for your interest. But it is also a pleasure for me to introduce to you the moderator. When we gathered and sort of planned out the 4 forums that we're hosting, I could not have picked a better person to moderate this particular panel. Joe Clark, who is president of the Eckerd Family Foundation, has devoted his professional life to serving the kids who sometimes get lost in the system and helping troubled kids get back on the road to success. And there's no one like him. I can't even describe to you how grateful we are for the work that he's done throughout the years, and there's no better spokesman, I think, for the Project on Accountable Justice to lead this particular thing. And I just wanted to say thank you, Joe, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for your very kind words. It is a real pleasure to be here this evening. You know, if we took part of the title and we asked any parent or anyone who has helped raise a teenager, are kids really different? They'd look at you like you're crazy. I mean, where have you been? Of course, everybody knows the answer to that. But each year, we take thousands of young people, and they enter what we call the juvenile justice system. Some of them have done some very serious things. Some of them have been guilty of one-time bad behavior, but they end up in the juvenile justice system. And perhaps rightfully so. We need some way to hold young people accountable. We want to address the issue that has brought them into the system, and we hopefully want to help prepare them to continue on in life, whether that is through continuing an educational or vocational opportunity. We want them on the road to good citizenship. But many, many times when they come into the system, we expect these young people, these children, to act and behave like thoughtful, responsible adults. And of course, we know that it doesn't work that way. And this is something that we have struggled with for a long time and at great cost to society, cost in terms of dollars and outcomes. I've been told that our first juvenile court in the United States opened over 100 years ago in 1899 in Chicago. And the reason, of course, that it came about is because kids are different. We've been at this a long time. Too often our decisions have been guided by politics. You're either viewed as perhaps too soft or too hard, or you just know this is the way things ought to work, as opposed to being guided by data, by knowledge, by what we know and has proven to work. And of course today we know a lot more. Perhaps you saw some of those slides. We know a lot more about brain development. We know that it's been proven now that you're really not an adult, becoming a young adult, capable of making decisions until you're almost 25. Having a younger son who just turned that age, I have told him, you're out of excuses, no more. But we know a lot about brain science and development. We know that about 50% of the young people who come into this system have a mental disorder. And we know a lot about other systems as well. We know that about 30% of kids who were in the foster care system, the child welfare system, come over into the juvenile justice system. So tonight we are going to get a unique perspective on these issues, and I hope that you will all take the opportunity to ask some questions. And some of the questions that may come up as our panel is presenting their views that you may want to follow up on might include, what does the current research on adolescent development suggest for policies for young offenders? Are kids in the United States much different than the rest of the world? Are there kids that are just beyond repair and we need to get them out of society forever? Is disproportionate minority contact something that we need to be concerned about? How do juveniles end up in the adult system? Is that an effective way to reduce juvenile crime and recidivism, to send them into the adult system? How are mental health and substance abuse issues related to the system, and what are we doing about it? And how do we handle these children when they are effectively incarcerated? So we're fortunate tonight to have a panel that I think can offer some very diverse and unique perspectives. And I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will address you. And I'm not going to go into great detail about their biographies and their background and experience because it's all here for you to read. And as they talk, I think you will see the depth of their involvement in this system. So first, and to my immediate right, is Amjel Qureshi, who is staff counsel with the National Prison Project of the American Civil Liberties Union, who's here from Washington, D.C. To my right is Jeanette Mall, Juvenile Justice Policy Analyst, the Center for Effective Justice at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and she'll tell you what that is about. To my left is Judge Irene Sullivan, senior judge from the 6th Judicial Circuit, that's here in Pinellas County, who brings a wealth of experience in the juvenile and family divisions and is the author of a very good book called Raised by the Courts. And finally, batting cleanup is my good friend Major Scott Ballou, who is the division commander of the Juvenile Justice Division in Seminole County Sheriff's Office. So we welcome them tonight, and we look forward to their remarks and to your questions. So, Ajmel, could you please come and get us started?
Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Ajmel Qureshi. I'm staff counsel at the ACLU's National Prison Project. I'll just say a couple of words about what the National Prison Project does, and then I'll launch into my topic of discussion with you this evening. So the National Prison Project is the branch of the American Civil Liberties Union that works on conditions of confinement in state prisons and state jails and local jails around the country to ensure that the conditions of confinement in those jails and prisons comply with constitutional requirements. It's a broad range of topics that we could talk about today related to conditions of confinement, but what I really want to talk with you about today is solitary confinement, and specifically the solitary confinement of juveniles and important revolutionary things that are happening in Florida or could happen in Florida related to the solitary confinement and juveniles. But before I get into that, let's start with some basic facts and figures and statistics, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, about the American criminal justice system and the criminal justice system in Florida. You know, as many of you probably know, the U.S. has 5% of the world's population, yet has 25% of the world's incarcerated persons. The incarceration rate in the U.S. is 4 times the average incarceration rate of most Western European countries. The United States incarcerates more people than South America, Central America, and the Caribbean combined. Florida, unfortunately, is a large contributor to this problem. In the United States, Florida incarcerates the 3rd largest number of people in the United States. And unfortunately, along with this, there are significant racial disparities in terms of who is being incarcerated. 1 in 4 African American children have grown up with a parent incarcerated. So it's obvious. We put a lot of people in jail or in prisons. But I'm not telling you something that you don't know. I'm not telling you something new. And I'm not going to go into all of the reasons today as to why people end up in jail, because that would be an entirely different discussion. What I want to talk about today is simply what happens to them once they get to jail, and whether or not what happens to them once they get to jail is making them a more productive person, such that once they enter back into society, they'll be able to contribute in a meaningful way. And what I want to argue today before you is that this one particular practice, which is used in prisons and jails across the country, and prominently in Florida, specifically the solitary confinement of juveniles, is not only not contributing to making them better people, but is significantly harming their mental and physical health. So what are we talking about when we talk about solitary confinement? What does solitary confinement actually mean? So how many people have seen Shawshank Redemption? Okay, so how many people are familiar with the concept of the hole? All right, so that's pretty much, I mean, it may not be that stark in every single state or in every single local jail or state prison, but that's essentially the idea, the picture that you can have in your head of what solitary confinement means. It's the hole in Shawshank Redemption that Andy Dufresne is thrown in when he disobeys, the prison warden's orders. I mean, sometimes it can be a cell as small as 12 by 12, usually with a hole in the middle for a person to defecate and release other bodily fluids into. There's no contact with the outside world or outside persons other than a tray that you're given your food through, on a daily basis. You're in that cell anywhere between 22 and 24 hours a day. There's no education in most cases, no rehabilitation. In most cases, you're let out for a shower maybe 3 times a week, After you've been in the hole for the first 30 days, you may get exercised in a cage, a small cage, depending upon what the weather is outside. So really, it's not the type of environment that's going to help people become better if they have serious mental issues. And so the ACLU conducted a report, a national report, where they talked to juveniles around the country who had been in solitary confinement. And in Florida, in particular, the problem is exacerbated by the fact that a large number of juveniles are put into the adult criminal system. And Florida does not draw distinctions in terms of punishing juveniles. So juveniles are subject to the same dangers in terms of solitary confinement that adults would be. Florida is one of the national leaders in trying juveniles as adults. Florida is also one of the national leaders in having the sheer number of juveniles in the adult prison system. So these are the words of one 16-year-old who was in solitary confinement. The only thing left to do is go crazy. Just sit and talk to the walls. Sometimes I go crazy and I can't even control my anger anymore. See, they say it's going to make you better, but it really didn't change me. It just gave me a worser attitude. So I've been trying to paint this mental picture for you of what solitary confinement is like. You're trapped away from the outside world. You're a juvenile, so certainly you haven't had any experience with this type of environment before. You're in there nonstop, and you're in there for a prolonged period of time all by yourself. It was estimated in 2005 that nearly 80,000 people across the United States were in solitary confinement. As mentioned, in Florida, juveniles as young as 16 years old are in solitary confinement. Not surprisingly, it's estimated that between 1/2 and 1/3 of people in solitary confinement have serious mental illnesses. If they don't have the mental illnesses once they go in, certainly they're exacerbated by the fact of being in this particular environment. So you're thinking, all right, there's this guy from the ACLU here. He's talked about Shawshank Redemption. He's going on and on about how terrible prison is. What is that telling me that I don't already know, and why should I care? Well, there's two ways you could look at it. One, you could look at it from a human rights perspective, and I being from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, certainly we look at things from a human rights and an international human rights perspective. And so Juan Mendez, who's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture, has said, it may be torture to hold a person in solitary confinement for more than 15 days. So we could be violating international law through such practices. So that may speak to some of you, to perhaps the students back there, violates international law. But, to some others, we may say, well, the UN doesn't have an army. They're not going to come and take down Florida's jails. Why should I care if it violates international law? Well, this is my second argument as to why I think you should care. Because the reality is that, certainly after the Supreme Court's most recent decisions in Miller and Graham severely limiting juvenile life without parole, the reality is that most of these juveniles are going to end up back out in public society at some point. So the question is, what type of person do you want living next door to you? What type of person do you want contributing to society? What type of person do you want working with you on a day-to-day basis or working with your family? Do you want somebody who's been repeatedly put in this environment of solitary confinement, and essentially driven to a situation where they develop mental illness and aren't able to contribute productively? Or do you want someone who actually gets the treatment that they need? Especially as the Supreme Court has recently affirmed in various decisions that kids, as my esteemed moderator said, really are different. They've said they're different in 3 important ways. One, because they can't process necessarily all the relevant factors that go into decision making, they're less culpable for the decisions that they make. The Supreme Court has said this, not necessarily the body that moves quicker than all other bodies in society. Second, they've said juveniles are less likely to be able to deal with the trauma of punishment. That is, solitary confinement is going to have an even harsher and severer effect on children. And then finally, the Supreme Court has said that juveniles are less likely to reoffend. Illegal activity is more likely to be a random occurrence with juveniles than it is to be with adults. And so that makes all these concerns about solitary confinement even more prescient when we're talking about juveniles. So what can you do about it? What's going on in Florida that we can do to deal with this problem of solitary confinement in juveniles? And luckily, and this is why I'm so excited to be here today, there's a current bill pending in the Florida legislature, both in the Florida Senate and in the Florida House, Senate Bill 812, that specifically addresses the solitary confinement of juveniles. And it takes productive steps, and I think in a very reasonable way. I mean, the ACLU has been very open in that we've called for the elimination of use of solitary confinement on juveniles. And this bill doesn't go that far, but it takes very, very productive steps that we think goes towards solving a lot of the problems that we're concerned about, but still giving DOC and the other local jails and prisons the flexibility that they need to do their job. Essentially, it limits solitary confinement to 3 very specific circumstances: emergencies, protective situations, and disciplinary situations. And then beyond that, it limits the time that people can spend in solitary confinement to a range of between 24 and 72 hours. It includes sufficient mental health safeguards by requiring a suicide assessment check beforehand, and it also provides for adequate showers and outdoor exercise. There's going to be potentially movement on this bill next week, so this is an ample time for this hearing. And I think for those of you who are concerned or troubled by what I've said here today, I would encourage you to get more involved in reading up on Senate Bill 812 and the effect of solitary confinement on juveniles. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amjad. I really don't know anything about solitary confinement in Florida, so perhaps we'll get a question from somebody who has some experience about that later. Next is Jeanette Mall from the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Jeanette, glad you're here. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here and sitting down and chatting about this issue with us. We really appreciate it. As mentioned, I am with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We are a free market think tank based out of Austin, Texas. And one of the reasons that I'm here with you today is a couple of years ago, we started a project named Right on Crime. And Right on Crime took us out of Texas and onto the national scene with work to bring conservative and center-right stakeholders and legislators and groups together to work on criminal justice in ways they really hadn't before. There were a lot of reasons why they hadn't been necessarily engaged on this issue, but they're now becoming engaged on this issue in almost every single state. They're knowledgeable and they're concerned and they're working on this hand in hand with partners across the political spectrum. So it's been an exciting process. As part of that work with Right on Crime, we have worked on some juvenile justice issues in several different states. And as I prepared for being here with y'all today, I thought there were 3 state stories in particular that would be very interesting and instructive as Florida continues its work in juvenile justice reform. And those 3 states that I want to talk about with y'all real quick is Texas, Georgia, and Illinois. And the reason I chose those 3 states is because they all represent a very different way of coming about to juvenile justice reform. They had different drivers, they had different actors, they had different reasons to get involved. But kind of the end result that we're starting to see has been the same. And I think that's the interesting part, and that's the part that the other states are looking at. So I'm going to start with Texas, because that's my home state, and I'm going to take a point of personal privilege and start with a Lone Star state. Texas began its journey towards juvenile justice reform in 2006, and it wasn't a choice that Texas had. Texas was thrown into it because of some scandals. There was rampant media reports about abuses that were occurring in our state facilities, both physical and very serious sexual abuses. And this happened to occur right before the legislature went into session. This wasn't something that the legislature knew about because the agency at the time had actively concealed it from them. So it was news to them, and it was shocking. They had been under the impression that they were entrusting Texas youth to these facilities for rehabilitation, and they did not know what the kinds of things that were really going on. So this shone a light on the true conditions in juvenile facilities for legislators in a way that they were not aware of. And there were a couple of things that happened instantaneously. The first one was judges immediately on their own began stopping sending kids to these facilities. They lost trust in the facilities. And so unless it was the absolute last case thing to do, they did not send any more youth to these facilities. And so you saw an immediate drop off in the population in our state facilities. The legislature then, in 2007, a few months after these abuses came to light, immediately took action and said, no matter what, we are no longer going to commit a youth guilty of only a misdemeanor to these facilities. They banned all misdemeanor youth from any placement in a state facility. And the reason that they did that was the recognition that these facilities, they're not a good place to be sending kids. And so if you have any other options, if the kids really aren't at the worst of the worst, you don't need to be sending them to these facilities. There's better options out there. And so the legislature took a chunk of the money that they would have spent on incarcerating those youth in state facilities and gave it to the counties. And when I say a chunk of money, it's because in Texas, our state facilities cost $350 a day. So every single day that you are not sending the youth to those facilities, you're racking up a huge amount of savings. So they took just a portion, just $50 million, and sent it to the counties to handle these youth. And it was about 3,000 youth every single year that would now be handled at the county level rather than in the state facilities. So that was another significant drop-off in the populations in Texas state facilities between 2007 and the next time that the legislature came into session in 2009. And in 2009, the legislature was looking at what they had done in 2007. They were looking at the outcomes from these facilities, and they decided to take yet another step. They looked at the cost savings that they had in front of them from saving that $350 a day. And they looked at what the counties were doing for these youths previously committed to them. They saw that the counties were doing a better job. They saw the counties were able to reduce recidivism rates and reduce crime rates. And they said, we're going to take another step forward, and we're going to entrust more of our youth to counties rather than to the state. And they set up what we call the Commitment Reduction Plan. Nationally, it's Juvenile Justice Reinvestment. And basically, it's a deal brokered between the state and the counties or some local form of government that basically says, for every youth that you retain in your jurisdiction, in your facilities, and your programs, rather than send to the state, we're going to give you this amount of money. If you succeed and you keep that youth and that youth does not ever end up coming to the state facility, you can keep that money. If you fail and you end up having to send that kid to the state, we're going to claw that money back. And the reason that that works so well is both sides are accountable. The state has to pony up the money in the first place. The county has to perform. If either one of those two things doesn't happen, then the system is going to revert to the old ways. So neither entity is at risk, but both entities are also acceptable. And so under this program, counties were given a per diem of $140 per day for every youth that they retained within their jurisdiction rather than send to the state. And the only requirements was that they had to spend it on an evidence-based program that was community-based. And the reason that the legislature put those requirements on the counties is because what you all in this room know, the evidence-based programs work. You mentioned the data before. This was looking at the data, knowing what works to reduce crime and reduce recidivism, and spending the money on what we know works rather than on the state facilities. So in the next 2 years after that, from 2009 to 2011, we saw another very large drop in our state facilities. It was a 68% drop between 2006 and 2012. We've closed 3 state facilities just in that time frame. Since the early 2000s, we're down from 15 facilities to we're about to only have 5 state facilities. And the counties are continuing to exceed expectations. Recidivism rates for the youth placed in these community-based programs are a fraction of what they were at the state level. And the juvenile crime has also not been affected by this move. Juvenile arrest rates in Texas have dropped at rates that exceed the national average. So our communities are safe, more juveniles are being rehabilitated, and the state is saving hundreds of millions of dollars every single biennium. The other state that I want to talk to you about next is Illinois. And Illinois they did a lot of the same things that Texas did, but they did it first, which is not something that we admit very often. Illinois took this on in 2004. Unlike Texas, Illinois did not have a scandal on their hands. They did have conditions of confinement in their state facilities, that every state did, but there wasn't this brewing scandal that the legislature was forced to deal with. What Illinois had in 2004 was a legislator that noticed what Ohio was doing with spending money on evidence-based, community-based programs, and said, you know what, I think Illinois could do that too. And so it was one legislator who started fighting for these programs, put a pilot program into the budget, and diverted just a very small amount of money, I think it was less than $1 million for the first year, to begin using commitment reduction and justice reinvestment programs in Illinois. And Illinois structured theirs in a way just like Texas did. Counties received a set amount of money for retaining a youth in their jurisdiction rather than sending them to the state level. They have a lot of freedom in the types of programs that they can choose, just as the Texas counties do. But it has to be those evidence-based, community-based programs, and it has to cost less than a day in the state facilities. Fortunately, what we have out of Illinois that's really unique is really excellent data on the outcomes and the successes that they've had. They just released a report that shows in just the first 6 years of this program, they saved $40 million and only spent $12 million on these community-based placements. But better yet, and the thing that we get really excited about, is the recidivism rates. Reincarceration for youth placed with this program in Illinois is less than 14%. Recidivism for these same types of youths, this was a controlled study, same types of youths placed in the state facilities, over 50%. And that means that those are additional dollars that the state saves every single year that that youth is not returning to a facility. It's communities that are continually growing safer and safer every day, juveniles that are becoming part of the workforce or going to college instead of being stuck in the system. So Illinois has been a great example for us about how you can start very small with justice reinvestment, just a pilot program in a couple of counties, and it can grow even larger. The next kind of task for Illinois to take on is bringing Cook County, which is where Chicago is, into the program. They haven't yet for a lot of different reasons, and as soon as they do that, Illinois will really be able to kind of multiply those savings and those public safety benefits. The final state that I wanted to talk about to y'all real quick is Georgia. Your neighbor to the north just passed juvenile justice reforms out of their Senate a couple of days ago. And Georgia came about this in a completely different way than both Illinois and Texas did. Georgia has been working on getting legislation like this passed for more than a decade. There's a group of very dedicated advocates and academics in the state that have noticed these problems in their system and have been urging the legislature to do something for years. And so far, up until this year, nothing really kind of got going. They got some little bills every now and then, but no big, massive reform. Finally, this last legislative session, what happened was Governor Deal tasked a special counsel with juvenile justice reform. It was the same special counsel that successfully passed criminal justice reform the year previous. And then Governor Deal asked them to take on juvenile justice reform. And having that kind of buy-in from the legislature really served to be the linchpin for getting reform passed in the state. And what the special counsel found after hearings and testimony and hearing from the stakeholders and the folks on the ground and talking to law enforcement and talking to prosecutors and just everyone involved in the system is there were a couple of pressure points on the system in Georgia. They had very high rates of misdemeanors and status offenders in their state facilities. And they realized, just as Texas did, kids at that low risk really don't often need to be in the state facilities. But they actually also went a step further, and they said that out of all of the felony offenders that we're sending to state facilities in Georgia, some of them don't need to be there either. We have designated all felonies in such a way that has prevented us from determining high-risk use, low-risk use, the types that need to be in facilities, and the types that could be safely handled at home. And so they put all of these findings into a piece of legislation that, like I said, just unanimously passed their Senate a couple of days ago. It's forecasted to save them $80 million in the next 5 years. And we know, given the results from other states, that when they're spending this money on evidence-based programs in the community, they'll have better public safety results as well. So Georgia is a great way to look at it as a very kind of long-term approach. Sometimes it takes 10 years. It doesn't always, but Georgia shows us that eventually they can get it done. And I just want to leave you with two notes on all of these states and the other states that we work on with juvenile justice reform. There are two common themes that we see in every single effort, both before and after successful implementation of reforms. And the first one is collaboration. There is no state that has been successful in juvenile justice reform without having every single entity, every single stakeholder at the table. You can't leave law enforcement out. You can't leave prosecutors out. You can't leave the advocates out. You can't leave the legislature out. Everyone needs to be at the table and part of the discussion before the first line of text in a bill gets written. Because it's without that kind of buy-in and that institutional support from every single type of stakeholder there is, it won't work. And we've seen states fail when they haven't kind of used that collaboration and having everyone on the same page before you even try to get going. And the reason that that's so important is, you know, even if you could get a bill passed without everyone on board, when you're actually implementing it in practice, if law enforcement and the prosecutors and juvenile probation and everyone else doesn't support it and doesn't understand it and doesn't agree with what you're doing, there's not going to be fidelity to the results. And that's really kind of been a huge hampering in states that haven't used collaboration and yet still got bills passed. The second point and I'll leave you with this, evidence and data is so crucial to these efforts. Because even if you can get the bill passed, even if you get all the stakeholders on board and you have that collaboration, if you can't go back to your legislature in 4 years and say, we've saved $40 million, juvenile crime is down 10%, and recidivism has been cut in half, they're not going to keep funding you. And the only reason that in Texas we've been able to keep this going for 6 years now is because we have the evidence to show that it's working. We have the evidence to prove to the legislature that the money that they're spending is going towards a good cause. More juveniles are being rehabilitated, that they need to keep on this course rather than returning to the old way of thinking. And there are some states that are kind of jumping into juvenile justice reform without that commitment to data and evidence and research. And I worry that in the long term, they're going to have some backsliding. And so no matter what, when you take on juvenile justice reform, you need to be focusing on the evidence, proving it up to the legislature and to the citizens. They're going to want to know that their tax dollars are being spent in positive ways and that their juveniles are being taken care of as well. So those are two very important things to keep in mind. And with that, I will leave y'all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeanette. I think we've all, or many of us have heard it said that change is driven by public policy, or public safety and money. And thank you for giving us some examples of how that change occurs through the use of data and research in some of our neighbor states. Next is my good friend, Judge Irene Sullivan, who I've had the pleasure of working with for a number of years. So, Judge Sullivan, we're pleased to have you with us tonight. And I believe you were, was it 12 years on the bench in dealing with these population of kids? Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you to the college and the Institute for inviting me here. It's nice to see everyone here this evening. And I have to thank again my good friend Joe Clark, because there was no one in my 12 years of experience more generous to juvenile law projects, juvenile justice projects, than the Eckerd Foundation and its chief, Joe Clark, here. So let's give him a big round of applause. He did so much, and I know many of you know that. I was a juvenile judge for 12 years, from 1998 until 2011, when I was kicked out by age. And I say that not to emphasize my age, but I would never have left that wonderful job. But we have some age limits in our Florida Constitution, so I was kicked out by age. It was a great job, a wonderful job, and I miss it. I wish I was still on the bench. I miss the kids. You know, kids are kids. And, you know, there were days when I would be so frustrated with them and angry, and they made me crazy, just like my own kids. There were days when I had tears in my eyes and my heart went out to them. There were days that I was mystified by them and their behavior, but they made it interesting every day. And there are days that we had a lot of fun in court, too, because I think when you mix kids and lawyers together in the same courtroom, you know, you can have fun, because lawyers are a lot like kids, I used to tell them. But another wonderful thing about being a juvenile judge was working with the people on the ground, the troops, the juvenile probation officers, the state attorneys, the public defenders, because they're the ones, I mean, we judges sat on a bench in a kind of sterile courtroom, but they're the ones out in the homes and on the neighborhoods and working so hard in the offices to create new and good programs for kids. Some of them are here tonight, and I know they're going to be embarrassed, but I am going to name their names, from the state attorney's office, who helped so much in our diversity diversion programs, Kathy Gibson, our alternative sanctions coordinator, who thought about things other than locking up kids for their sanctions and punishments, Michelle Jameson, Adrienne Conwell, and her team of juvenile probation officers, a couple of whom I've seen here tonight. And I'm just going to ask you to stand up, and I'm going to ask people to give them a big round of applause, too. You can just stand up briefly and then sit down. These really are, you know, the troops on the ground, and we talked about, Jeanette talked about collaboration, and some of the things I'm going to tell you about that we did were a total result of the collaboration of these people who, without being paid another extra cent or ever getting pay raises from the state for the last 7 years, did give of their time and their hearts and the time they would spend with their families and fun to sit in meetings and develop some really good programs for kids that worked. In the 12 years that I was a juvenile judge, which were the same 12 years that Joe was at the Eckerd Family Foundation, and we were talking about that tonight, we were there at a period of reform, which was great because it gave me such a good perspective, because in my practice of law, I had never dealt with juvenile justice or even adult crime or even family law. I was more of a civil trial lawyer. So this was all new to me, and when I first came to juvenile court, I tell you, the first couple of months I was just kind of in shock because I didn't realize how much violence the kids that were coming before me, both in dependency court, abuse, abandonment, neglect, and in delinquency court, the kids committing crimes, how much violence that they were experiencing at a very young age, and sustained violence, not just in the streets. If they lived in a bad neighborhood and there were drug busts or drive-by shootings, there were plenty of those, but within their own homes. The domestic violence, the fights that they got involved in with their mother's boyfriend and so on. And I thought, how can these kids go to school in the morning, especially if it starts at 7 o'clock at high school, and learn, you know, geometry or geography or whatnot, you know, when they've been up all night hearing this violence, when there's no food in the refrigerator. And that's kind of what drove me to get involved with these wonderful people I just introduced you to try to help to change this here in Pinellas County. One of the things we did, well, first of all, I learned another perspective about reforms, and we have a wonderful title tonight, Kids Are Different. And it's kind of interesting because some people have been involved in juvenile justice for years and years, for 50 years, and they remember a time when we were trying to advocate, when the advocates for juveniles were trying to advocate that they should be treated like adults. Give them a lawyer at every trial, give them rights to cross-examination, and maybe jury trials, and all the evidence kind of decisions that go with adult crime and so on. They need those rights. And I do agree that they should have those rights, but there was a lot of emphasis on kids should be treated like adults and get the same rights in the criminal or juvenile justice system. Well, we've come all the way around now to the fact that kids are different. And a lot of that has been driven by, and Joe mentioned it and others did too, the fact that we now know scientifically that kids' brains are still developing when they're teenagers. And whether it's 21 or 22 or 25 or what age they mature, and girls a little earlier than boys, they are driven by their teenage behavior, which is still developing and growing and maturing. And one thing that impressed me in court so much was the lack of impulse control that these kids had. That so often the crimes I was seeing was almost no premeditation. You know, a girl who's been sexually abused, and then a school resource officer grabs that girl to redirect her or to discipline her, is going to react against that officer. She's going to flail back and hit her or him. And yet, so often these kids were charged with crimes, battery on a police officer. No one understood, first of all, that the background she had of abuse, and secondly, that so many kids react out of just instinct and impulse. And I know in Florida it's a hard defense. You almost have to prove insanity to have a defense like that, and it wasn't that far. But I always thought that public defenders should perhaps be thinking of making an argument of just this is a kid and this was instinctive and poor impulse control. It's just part of their developing brain. So we began to, in the beginning, have so many kids in our detention centers that they were sleeping on the floor. And kids were being arrested in school for things that were really school offenses under a zero tolerance policy that were filling up the courts and filling up the dockets and the detention center, sometimes at a cost, overnight detention, of $250 each day. That means if they spent the night, the county had to pay $500 for a kid who might have just missed school. But because he was on probation, this was a violation of probation, and the school resource officer arrested him and he was brought in. So we were having a lot of disconnect in what the judges and the people who worked in court thought should be happening versus the people on the streets and schools. So again, generously funded by the Eckerd Family Foundation and Joe Clark, we were sent to Miami, a team of us, and we learned from the woman who is now our present Secretary of Juvenile Justice, Wansley Walters, what she was doing in Miami to reduce the amount of arrests of kids. Because other than public safety, and you have to arrest if public safety is involved. And that was our first job as a juvenile judge, to protect the public, just like an adult criminal judge. If the kid was a threat to the public, the kid should be arrested. But first-time use of marijuana or shoplifting for the first time or hitting another kid at school, we had to ask ourselves, what does an arrest accomplish? It just gets on the kid's record, makes it harder to get a job, a scholarship, get in the military, and so on. So Secretary Walters, when she was head of the Juvenile Services Center in Miami, taught us how she had reduced the arrests and reduced juvenile crime, reduced recidivism, kept more kids in school, and having productive lives because of her civil citation program. So we learned from her. The Eckerd Family Foundation funded a team of us. She came up here and taught us again. Pinellas County was rather complicated to do this in because we have something like 26 different police departments, counting the sheriff and all the police departments. So these folks who I've just introduced you to and others had to come to these meetings with all these law enforcement people, some of whom had their own diversion programs, and the state attorney did, which were very good. And we tried to take an inventory of what we had and then get it organized in a fashion that we could serve more kids without having them arrested. So what we organized was called the Juvenile Arrest Avoidance Project. And what we did was, for a first-time offender, especially for a misdemeanor, a kid would be assessed at the assessment center for what services they need. If they were smoking marijuana, they needed a drug program. If they were shoplifting, they needed an anti-shoplifting program. And as long as the child and the parent agreed to go through that program and successfully complete it, there wouldn't be an arrest record filed. There wouldn't be on their record at all. So not a prosecution, but not an arrest, and that's what we thought was so important. So we started in 2008, and within 2 years, we had 2,000 people. It's kind of shocking that many kids were committing these little crimes, but we had 2,000 people go through the program with about a 90% success rate and a very low, I think less than 10% recidivism rate. And so none of those kids have an arrest on their record. And that's to the success of the people who worked so hard in that program. Because of that, everything, it's kind of like dominoes or something, or a jigsaw puzzle. When you do one thing, it moves another thing around. So because of that, we had fewer kids in court. We could spend more time with the more serious crimes. And although juvenile crime is down, I think violent crimes are still up, if not increasing, because of guns and the violence these kids experience in their homes. But we were able to reduce the census of our detention center to at least maybe 40% or 50% of what it was, which we thought was great. Secretary Walters is now doing that on a statewide level, of course, in Tallahassee, and I think her roadmap for success, which follows the Blueprint Commission that we also worked on, is going to produce the kind of reforms, hopefully, that Texas and Illinois and Georgia, our neighbor to the north, are sustaining. Florida is an interesting and big state to do it in, but certainly Texas was. So we don't want to have a scandal like that, but we want the reforms. One other and last thing I'm going to tell you about that we worked so hard in our court with was girls, and we had special programs. Karen Popkowski is here. She was a dedicated juvenile probation officer who worked with troubled and at-risk girls. And girls More and more are in the juvenile justice system. They didn't used to be, and they're not in there for the burglaries or robberies that some of the boys are, but they're in there because they themselves are victims of violence, and they're reacting a lot. They're reacting by using drugs, they're reacting by running away, not going to school, and so on. So we developed a special girls court that's still continuing special girls programs, and we're so proud in Pinellas County also to have PACE, a center for girls that's not residential, but it's a day center that provides one-stop shopping and great treatment for girls, drug treatment, family counseling, and so on. There are 17 PACE centers all around the state. That might be something that Texas would be interested in, too. So again, thank you all so much for, first of all, electing me juvenile judge all those years ago, giving me this great experience, allowing me to work with these wonderful people, and I hope you have some good questions for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. Judge Sullivan raises a question that every time we see each other, we ask it, so to make sure this comes up, and that is, so what does arrest add, particularly in cases where we're dealing with nonviolent misdemeanors? One thing it does add that we sure know about is there's some great data that comes out of Miami that says it costs about $5,000 to arrest a kid in Dade County. When they have to go through all the system, the people who are involved. And there's data from around the state. Of course, the cost will vary by jurisdiction, but if we're talking about using our limited resources effectively, that's certainly one place to look. Judge Sullivan also recognized, she referred to the troops, and our cleanup man tonight, Major Scott Ballou, is really in charge of some of those folks who have the responsibility to enforce the law and to take care of these kids who come into the system. And I've heard him speak before, and I'm delighted that he could be with us tonight. Scott?
First and foremost, I would like to apologize for that. There's really no reason for anybody to have to see that. I thought I knew what I was going to talk about, and then I started listening to some of the other presenters, and some of what I had to say has changed significantly. I am the cop, so I'm supposed to be the bad guy here. I'm supposed to tell you how all of these things won't work. Fortunately, I'm not the only cop in the room. I think some of my friends from Tallahassee are here somewhere, which makes me feel better. And what I will tell you, though, is that everyone here has alluded to what the solutions are. And the solutions really are going to be all of us working together. Law enforcement is designated with a very difficult task. We are told what to do by every segment of society, by government, by the people who are in the jails, by the people who are going to go to the jails, by the people who pay the taxes, by the people who don't pay the taxes. Everybody has some input as to how we do what we do. And it's very difficult sometimes for us to balance consequence and public safety. Do I agree that prison sentences for juvenile offenders in most cases, 99.9% of those cases, is ineffective and probably the wrong thing to do? Absolutely. But do I believe that we have to have a way to keep people who are predators and prey on our communities away from the members of our communities? Yes, I do agree with that. It's interesting, I was talking to Jeanette as we were getting started tonight about a summit that I spoke at last week in our county. Our county seat is Sanford, Florida. Some of you may have heard of Sanford over the course of the last year. It's been in a number of news stories about some things that we will not discuss tonight because some of you may be called to sit on that jury. And if you didn't know that, now you do. We've had approximately somewhere between 43 and 48 shootings in a very small area of historic Sanford since October. And that's pretty significant. And so the city of Sanford, with many of their partners, our school system, sheriff's office, public defender's office, prosecutor's office, a number of different community organizations put together this summit. And among the people who were at that summit were a group of young men who live in that community, who are high school students, teenagers, 16, 17, 18 years old. And they were part of each one of the different tables that were going to come up with solutions as to a plan for how we were going to attack the problem in the city of Sanford. And we did something very similar to what we're doing tonight, where we had a panel of people who talked about their different area of expertise. And then we took questions from the audience members and the people who were going to be participating in these little workshops at their tables. And the best questions in the room came from those kids. And a couple of the questions, one specifically, one of the young men asked me, he actually stood up and pointed at me and said, "I have a question for you. What benefit is there to a 16-year-old by putting him in prison?" And my answer to that young man was zero. There is no benefit to that young man for putting him in prison. Now, a lot of people in that room who are my colleagues and law enforcement officers probably don't share necessarily that same opinion. But I think we can all agree that there is zero benefit to putting anybody in prison to that individual. How often do they come back rehabilitated? How often do they come back productive members of society? Very rarely. In fact, within 3 years, 60% of those people who come back from a Department of Corrections prison are going to reoffend. 60%. That's in 3 years. The numbers go up after that. It is significant that we put people in prison expecting that they will come back and not recidivate, but we provide no support system for them in the communities that they come back to. Some of the things that I wanted to talk about were some things that I wrote down listening to some of the other speakers. We talked about direct files to the adult system, and I do believe that there is reform that needs to be done in that area. I personally find it egregious that we would take a 14, 15, or 16-year-old child who has not committed a aggravated sexual battery or a homicide and send that child to prison. I'm probably on one end of the scale, and in between there's a lot of people who need to make that decision. Juvenile detention confinement. Without ever having worked in a juvenile detention facility, I could have told you what I thought the answer was. First, before I continue too much longer, let me say that I am speaking from the position of one of 65 sheriffs. Sheriff Esslinger, who is our sheriff in Seminole County, allowed me to come and speak on his behalf tonight. And I am speaking as one county of 3 in the state of Florida who have juvenile detention facilities. So I'm only talking about us and what we do in Seminole County, not the other 64 sheriffs or the other 2 counties that run detention. But what I can tell you is that when we had an interesting opportunity in March 2011, the Department of Juvenile Justice identified our detention center, Seminole County's detention center, as one that was going to be closed. And the sheriff had had an interest in operating juvenile detention for many, many years. And so we were very excited about it, not that they were closing, but that the opportunity would be presented that we would be able to operate our own detention center. The facility was built in 1972 with one modification in 1984. So it was a very, very old facility, and it was structurally, it was one big confinement cell. There was very little light. There were almost no windows. It was all concrete block construction. And so one of the first things that we did when we went into that facility was to talk about how can we create an environment here that will reduce our likelihood of youth-on-youth violence, that will reduce our likelihood of officer-involved responses to resistance or uses of force, and yet be a safe environment for those children who are going to be in the facility and the officers who are going to have to work in the facility. And for any of you that may be from a corrections background or have some experience with working in a jail, there's 2 types of supervision in a jail. There is one that is a population supervision, where you have an officer who's in control of a pod or a module, and he is that officer, he or she is on the outside of the module, and the detainees are on the inside of the module. And historically, we know, because science and research has told us, that that type of supervision has a tendency to create an environment where there is more, especially inmate on inmate or detainee on detainee violence. But there's also a direct supervision model, which is a model where there are no cells. There is a large room that is segregated, locked, but there is no cells inside that room. There's more of a dormitory atmosphere, and there is a detention officer who works in that room with those particular detainees. Fortunately for me, because the education was invaluable, we had just done a jail modification and revision at our facility, and we had opened up 2 very large direct supervision modules. So I spent probably 4 days in jail. I didn't sleep there, but I did spend almost all day there in those direct supervision units, watching the interactions of the people who were in that unit. And so when we designed our juvenile detention center, we based it on that model. We took over a facility that had a 2-bed cell, and every cell with a door that locked, a big steel door that locked. So the first thing that we did was go in and take off 80% of the doors. Took the doors off, cut the walls down, so that each one of those bays was now an open bay with bunk beds and facilities, and an ability for 2 things. One, you can't hide in a room that has no wall, and from us, and then there's no shenanigans that are going to go unnoticed while you're in that room with no walls. So when it comes to confinement, as we move into where I was trying to get, we do use solitary confinement. However, we do not use solitary confinement for youth who are suicidal, because in our opinion, a child is more likely to commit suicide while they're locked in a cell where we can't watch them than if they are walking with an employee of our detention center 24 hours a day. And meaning walking when they're awake, when they're asleep. They sleep in movable bunk beds that are at the officer's station. We don't detain youth for discipline violations, generally for more than an hour. I think our average is less than a day, and our moderate is probably somewhere close to an hour for disciplinary confinement. The only youth that we do confine are youth who have been determined by our medical staff to be infectious. Either they have some form of parasite or some viral or bacterial infection as diagnosed by a medical professional that requires them to be away from the rest of the population. We talked about money in some of the conversations tonight, and money for community-based programming and community-based care. It's an interesting cycle. If you think about it from the perspective of a taxpayer, we all pay taxes to somebody. Sometimes we don't even know who somebody is, but that money goes somewhere, they take it from us, we give it to them, however that works out. Then that money is allocated to go to the state so that the state government can operate and do some of the things that it needs to do. In Florida, we talk about doing community-based supervision, community-based residential treatment, community-based, name it, and that's what we would like to do, but we don't have the money for that. What I'm suggesting is that we really do have the money for it, but the money ends up being spent somewhere else. I'm going to not do too much politicizing here, or I'll be yanked off the stage here in a moment, but what I would recommend as a taxpayer is that you pay attention to some of the legislation that's going on in Tallahassee, especially as it relates to juvenile justice and juvenile justice reform. And where is that money being spent? Does that money come back to your community to help the kids that are living in your community? You know, one of the reasons why we wanted our own detention center was so that the kids who were in detention in Seminole County were not a 2-hour drive away from their families, so that they were close enough to be present for visitation, so that they were in our county and could be seen by the same teachers or at least the same school system that was going to supervise them when they weren't in the facility. Let's see. Trauma-informed care. One of the things, and I believe it was my friend from the ACLU mentioned, is that, and I think everybody kind of has alluded to it, we look at kids, and sometimes, because of the things that they do, we do have a tendency to lump them in with adults. But if you spend any time working with delinquent youth or kids who are on the brink of delinquency, you're going to find that the majority of those kids have some trauma in their history that is influencing the way they've been socialized and the way that they are acting. What I have learned just in the last 10 years that I've been intimately involved in our juvenile programs is that we disregard that. Not we, me, not we, the sheriff's office, not we, but for the most part, the juvenile justice system talks about it, but we really don't put any teeth to it. We don't invest the time and money into the things that would probably help in those situations. You know, I heard the judge talk about girls, and I think that Jeanette may have talked a little bit about the rise in juvenile crime as it relates to our female population, and that the majority of that is caused by some trauma that's happened in their life. There's big numbers to suggest that many of those kids have been sexually abused, that female population. But spend some time with a deep-end male, and you will find that they are some of the angriest people you've ever met in your life. And that anger comes from abuse, neglect, and abandonment. All of these kids are suffering traumas in their life. So all of the treatment that we have to offer should be coming from that trauma-informed care background. I probably didn't say anything that you thought I was going to say. I probably didn't talk about the things maybe that you wanted me to talk about, but I'll be happy to answer any of the questions that you have. I wanted to thank the college for having me here. I wanted to thank Deborah for inviting the sheriff, who then invited me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, now it's time to hear some of you folks talk. And so as you kind of settle in here, we'll have the microphone coming around. And so I think we've heard, a number of themes here tonight, common themes, from different perspectives, from an advocacy perspective on a high level, working down to how this really works from the perspective of a jurist and also law enforcement who deal with these issues on street level. So what do you think about this? Let's take some questions. Ma'am, down in front.
First I want to say to Ms. Sullivan, we have something in common. I was laid off for age too. And I worked about 43 years in education, 16 years in New York State, and when I moved down here in Pinellas County School System, I did a lot of work in special ed. And I do want to say that it depends upon the system. For 15 years, I was in Largo High School as a mentor and sort of a teacher. I used to be a paraprofessional in the system, and I worked a lot in special ed. So I know what has to be done, and yet the system don't listen to me or anything else. You name it, I did it with all these children, severely emotionally disturbed children. And when I was the in-school suspension teacher in middle school a few years back, I went to a special workshop with the Juvenile Welfare Board. I don't remember the person who gave the speech, but he was, a doctor or something, and he used to be a principal and supervisor and everything. And he said children that are in special ed should not be in school suspension for more than one period. And that was it. And I knew that, but I couldn't get anywhere with the principal.
So let me just ask, kind of refine your where I think you're headed here. Is your question then, why aren't we doing more appropriate intervention with these kids who we know need that help? Why is that not happening?
Oh, yes. All I know, in Pinellas County School, they should do it. And I can't get through to them just because I don't have a 4-year degree. I have a 2-year degree. And a few years ago, we had a different... right, I got to them here. Before that, they had a different superintendent years back,
Right.
Dr. Wilcox. And I approached him, and I tried to make an appointment with him to tell him about what in-school suspension should be like, you know. Because if I was able to create a program to get these kids out, you know, not to come in on a daily basis, and it worked before I left, you know, he didn't want to listen to me.
Well,
And
thank you.
I really got a little annoyed, you know. But this is my question. I have 2 questions. Before 1973, what was the percentage of our troubled youth in the United States? How many were in that sort of detention program? Because in 1973, I think it was that, Congress passed a law about civil rights. And because for children, you know that. I don't know if you knew that, but I found out. And ever since then, I would say a percentage of families who try to raise their kids the proper way, like I was raised as a child when I grew up, honor thy parents, honor thy parents, honor thy grandparents, honor the teachers. You would get it, just a little whack in the behind. You couldn't do that anymore after 1973 when children had civil rights and they could do anything they wanted.
I don't know the answer to the question about that you referred to in 1973, if you're referring to, you know, number of arrests, but maybe someone on the panel does. Maybe we ought to move to your other question, and not to cut you off, because I think you're voicing a very legitimate concern that, you know, we need to do things that work. And you obviously have a great deal of experience with this population of kids in getting good results. So I think we kind of get that. I think our challenge, isn't it, panel members, is to how we implement, how we get people to do what works, and some of these programs that are effective. How do we make change occur? Judge Sullivan.
Yes, Joe, I have a suggestion, because I certainly admire anyone who worked on an in-school suspension program, whether it was for behavioral kids or in a regular school, because we also did truancy court in our court, and it was horrifying to me to order a kid to go to school to have him suspended the next couple of days because of some school misbehavior, suspended out of school. So we used to have OSIPs, on-site intervention and prevention, which was an in-school suspension program, because that's where kids should be all day. I think out-of-school suspension should be illegal, except for weapons or felony amounts of drugs, perhaps, but they should be illegal for anything else, because when kids are on the street, they're just committing crimes during the school day. They should be in school, and you did a great thing by doing that.
Well, what I did with one school, this was middle school. You know, middle school is worse than anything else. I figured out a program how to get these kids to behave so they didn't have to come in all day, and it started to work before I left. But what I want to know is like the percentage of the troubled youth before that and the trouble after, because at that time the parents got to a point they had no rights to discipline the children.
Well, that's not really true. Parents do have rights. They cannot abuse, you know, the children, but they can, you know, spank a child. They can, and a lot of parents do that. Because I did the abuse, abandonment, neglect, and the only things that we removed children from or punished parents for was really significant child abuse, not just giving them a spanking.
Okay. Thank you. Let's give this gentleman a chance.
Yes, thank you. My question would be for any of the panelists, because I don't know. What is the method of post-judgment finding of guilty to determine level of custody or incarceration, and is it done administratively, or does the judge have the ability to say you will be in such and such an institute, or is that done simply administratively? And an adjunct to that is, if a person is in a custody facility, and the question about the putting them in the hole, as we've heard about, is that an administrative function or is it judicially reviewable?
Okay, Judge, you want to start with that?
Yes.
And then
I hate to hog the
maybe,
microphone. Yeah, and your first question was at the time of sentencing. The Department of Juvenile Justice is totally in control in Florida in what facility the child is placed in. The Department of Juvenile Justice probation officer gives a recommendation at the time after the trial of sentencing, and the judge, by law, has to follow that recommendation unless they make written findings why they deviate. But in any event, the judge just determines the level of commitment, low, medium, high, and the department picks out the facility.
Major Blue, maybe you could address the how
As
a
it
child may
as
come
it relates
yeah.
to confinement, was that it?
Is it judicially reviewable or simply administrative?
It is in our case, our policy is directed by the Florida Model Jail Standards, the Department of Juvenile Justice's detention policies, and then also the American Corrections Association accreditations. It's not judicially reviewable, except that every child is given an opportunity for a detention hearing and a detention review. So there are regular reviews as to whether or not a child can continue to be in detention. But if we make a confinement decision in one of the two situations that I talked about in our facility, either a disciplinary confinement or a medical confinement, neither of them are judicially reviewed. They're both administered internally.
I would like to add to that. That's an important question, and it brings up a point that I wanted to bring up, but I didn't have the chance to bring up. We've received different reports from across the country about what can get you into solitary confinement, and it's not always serious. I mean, sometimes it may be serious, but it's not always serious. And so we've heard reports about people skipping meals, talking back to guards, sharing food, as in some circumstances, the types of things in really bad jails or prisons that get people into solitary confinement. And the bill that, I'm here pushing today, SB 812, addresses that problem explicitly. It lists 4 circumstances in which people can be put in solitary confinement: sexual assault on another inmate or on a guard, serious bodily harm on another inmate or guard, an attempt to escape, and also 2 serious disciplinary infractions that interfere with the running of the system. And so the bill speaks to, I think, what may be an underlying point behind your question, in that it specifically limits the circumstances, in my opinion, to 4 reasonable circumstances that you would want, if you wanted to put people in solitary confinement, that you would put them into.
Thank you. That was a great question.
Joe, how are you?
It's my good friend Roy Miller from the Children's Campaign, who's pretty much an expert on this topic as well. Roy, it's good to have you.
It's good to be back. My question's for Major Blue, but I need to set the context for it. You described your operation, which all of us know, our organization, which is a watchdog and advocacy group, is very modern and progressive. But that's not true of all the sheriff's operations in the state. Jeanette brought up the fact that we should all be at the table when we pass legislation. And you also brought up that we all need to work together. But that's not how Senate Bill 2112 got passed in the state of Florida. Nobody was at the table. It was crammed down in legislative session in the appropriations process without any kind of substantive hearing. So now we have a situation in Florida where we have different sheriffs running different detention operations, some of which are very punitive, and some of which have already seen federal court action. So my question is, what are the sheriffs going to do to get people back to the table where we can have some kind of consensus agreement on how we're going to treat children in detention in the state of Florida? And I mean, maybe you can't answer this because maybe you're not on the Florida Sheriff's Association. Why are they so resistant to sitting down with everybody at the table and addressing the problems of that legislation.
I can speak for only my sheriff and have to do so carefully if I want to be employed tomorrow.
Okay, now, do we know, are we clear on exactly the piece of legislation? Does everybody in the room know what we're talking about, 2112?
2112 was the piece of legislation that passed allowing counties to operate juvenile detention centers outside the regulations of the Department of Juvenile Justice. And yes, I'm familiar. I sat through that entire process, and in fact, one of my staff members wrote a lot of the content with the help of other people that were on that committee as well. If I remember, two parts to the question. One was, why is the Florida Sheriff's not more involved in the process or in the discussions and conversations? Ask again, I'm sorry.
The Florida Sheriff's Association is resisting all efforts to have a public conversation about the problems with the legislation.
Okay.
And they haven't really been willing at all to take, other than taking testimony, to address the advocates' legitimate concerns about having potentially 60, not every sheriff is going to do this, but we've set in motion where every sheriff really gets to decide how to run their detention operation, because the model jail standards are really lax, and like you said, they don't have to adhere to the Department of Juvenile Justice standards, and they really don't have to adhere to, any other accreditation standards either. They can pretty much do their own thing.
I can't speak for the Florida Sheriff's Association. I can tell you that in my opinion, it goes back to issues with local control. We talked earlier in the conference room about some of these same things. And one of the things that I conceded, and I do so here now, is that if there is not a group keeping tabs on us, we have a tendency to go off track. I will not disagree with you at all. History would make me out to be a liar. But what I can tell you is that even the sheriffs don't all agree on how to operate detention. And so I agree with you that there is considerably more conversation to be had and more work to be done. But we do, and I speak for only our sheriff, and again, I think I can speak for some of the Florida Sheriff's Association, that we do want to have local control over detention. I personally invite and welcome the department or the Florida Model Jail Standards, ACA. We work very closely with David Utter with the Southern Poverty Law Center at our detention facility. We've asked him to sit on our advisory board because we do know that we need other people to tell us sometimes when we might be off track. But as for the body of the Florida Sheriff's Association, I can't speak definitively, but I can tell you that it is very much a matter of local control.
My name is David Outlaw, so I have a unique last name about being a criminal. But I want to let you know there's some things that are going on in society that we're all thinking and talking about right now. And no one's talking about the proliferation of guns in juvenile hands. And, the almost casual way they use them to shoot people, police officers, citizens, and other kids. And how can we stop those kind of crimes? And what kind of punishment is appropriate for these violent kids without any conscience? Is there anything being done in that regard?
Do any of you have a perspective on that? The
think
number of kids
I can go back
who
to
come
my opinion that I made earlier. There's not enough done from the perspective of those kids' traumas and the life that they have led up to that point. I don't agree that all of those kids are sociopaths. I don't agree that they are, they were born bad and that there's nothing that we can do about it. I think that when they rise to the level of committing a crime where they're taking someone's life or attempting to take someone's life, then I have an obligation from a public safety perspective to make that stop. But we have an obligation to find out why it's happening and to address those issues. And as I said when I was making my comments, I meet so many of these kids and they are so angry. It is difficult to comprehend how you get to be that angry without understanding all of the trauma and the things that they've experienced in their lives.
One of the things I just wanted to add to that is so much of the gun violent crime that we see is linked to gangs. And so communities that are being very innovative in their gang interventions are having more success in dealing with gun crimes than other communities. In gang intervention, there's a couple of things that we know works in gang intervention. For a lot of the youth that join gangs early on, it's a replacement for their family. They don't have family, they don't have someone to look up to, so they join the gang. So family therapy, getting the family back into a cohesive unit, one with a clear parental role and structure and disciplining the youth, is something that we know works in reducing gang influence. Other things, they're very minor, but they're really very effective. One of the things that Houston in Texas does, and they have a specialized docket just for juveniles involved with gangs. And so as judges that are experts in everything, you know, they know the colors, they know the hand signals, they know all the stuff that they need to know to get involved in this kid's life and intervene with the gang. And they actually have a tattoo removal program that's a huge part of their program, because getting, you know, the gang markings literally off the juvenile's body is, for some reason, incredibly effective at getting that juvenile the push he or she needs to get out of the gang. And so that's something that they've really kind of adopted as one of the first things that they'll do in this gang intervention docket. And it's surprisingly effective for such a minor, expenditure. But that's really going to be the number one way to reduce gun crime, is to get the gangs out of the cities.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, panel, for being here, first off. I'd like to just touch on a point that I believe Deb, her name was, said earlier, that the actual plan is to advance public safety. I really think it's more of evolving public safety, because every day this world is changing faster than most people realize it. And also another point is just to look around at the average age of a lot of people in here. They're not very close to being juveniles, and this world's a lot different than what it used to be when they were juveniles. So it's a lot harder for children to relate to people. And be able to respect the fact that what they're trying to do is to help them. What I'm trying to get to is what kind of creative steps now are we using inside and out of the facilities, such as like Deb's son. I actually was in the system when I was younger. He got some skills like making tattoos. I mean, some people might have different views on that, but how can we exploit the market of using newer things that these kids are actually interested in, such as music or other creative things? What are these facilities actually doing? Because I personally have seen kids incarcerated. I've been incarcerated. The things that are going on do not work. As far as I am concerned, I got no reform from them. More just educating myself. So what is happening now that is really reforming children versus just putting them into the system?
So if we have copies of the ACLU's report out there on solitary confinement, and one of the frequent questions we get in response is, what if, if not solitary confinement to deal with youths who are troubled, what do we do instead? And the two things that the report talks about, and I'm going to focus on one more than the other. One, it sort of talks about specific youth treatment facilities for youth to talk to the issues that motivated them to make the decisions they made in the first place, to give them the type of counseling that they need, whether it's drug treatment counseling or whether it's counseling related to abuse that they suffered growing up. What I think, and what I'm going to talk about a tiny bit more, and I think is a little bit more innovative, and this may have been what the major was referring to, is the report also talks about small group living situations, where essentially, a group sort of within a prison or within a jail forms its own community along with the disciplinary officer that supervises them. And that group itself polices itself, has its own meetings to discuss whether or not the group internally is working, whether or not everyone is sort of working their responsibilities, and also provides sort of a group psychiatric setting for the group to discuss among themselves, whether or not the issues that they have internally are being dealt with properly. So as opposed to the solitary confinement model in which a person is sort of locked up and left there by themselves, this sort of almost creates a society within a society where people can learn to sort of police themselves. And I think you really get at the heart of why we have certain laws and why it's important that children learn to follow laws, because it leads to the betterment of society for a whole. And I think just in general, the socialization process, I think, is something that a lot of people, or specifically a lot of youths, need. But I hear what you're saying. I think certainly working in culture into sort of what is happening is an important aspect of that.
Thank you. That's a good question. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you all for this very candid discussion. But I certainly don't think that we can really take on this discussion without really looking at ourselves as a society. What are we presenting to our children as the role of what they should be doing? Look at films, look at media. There's nothing there much that's positive. For the last 10 years, I've been working in the juvenile justice system, mostly in Texas and San Antonio, where I worked with juvenile justice judges. I teach poetry, creative writing, music improvisation in this setting. It's incredibly effective. I just recently moved here, and I have been working in two places, Pace Pinellas and Daniel Memorial. But for an entire year, I spent talking to the Department of Justice and several other facilities, explaining what I did, how it works. I have recommendations from judges. It falls on deaf ears. This is a system that cannot look outside of itself. So if you want the community to be involved, you have to open the doors for the community to be involved, not make it increasingly difficult. My question is, ultimately, as we see the prison system move further towards corporate oversight, then how do we make sure that our kids are getting the base service? Our job as a healthy society is to protect the most vulnerable. If we solve this problem, we solve hundreds of problems. So instead of trying to save money and skimp and really give austere living conditions and help, not that the entire system is bad. There's a lot of great people in there. But it's just about, so what do we do about that, this move towards corporate?
Well, let me see if I understand your question. You referred to corporate oversight. Are you referring to the privatization of?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We can go look at Gulf Academy.
So Jeanette, you talked about the power of incentives in addressing, these kids' issues, which means that let's do something that really works to get to the problem. And if you do it, you get rewarded. That seems to be kind of a fundamental American concept. Is there anything, how's that taking hold?
Yeah, well, I don't think it'll surprise anyone in this room to hear a free market think tank employee harp on about bureaucracy. I am no fan of having massive state systems handling juvenile justice because as we see from some of the majors' comments, some of the other things that we've heard tonight, when you give control and authority and discretion to the local authorities, you usually end up in a better system. And so making sure that you have enough of a striation in your system between the state and the local entities, if it's county or local government or whatever it might be, but then also making sure that there's transparency. There's a state that we've been working in where counties do have that oversight, but they're trapped into certain contracts with certain providers, some private, some public. They don't have the options. And because of that, they're not able to spend their money in the way that is best place, the most effective programs, the one that works best for their populations, whatever it is. So having freedom, in terms of the types of programs that they get involved with, the types of people that they get involved with is really important. And one of the things that we've seen in Texas is we've allowed our community-based systems to grow is counties are very quick to realize if a certain contractor, a certain provider that they're working with isn't working, and they make sure that they are able to extract themselves. We've made sure that the contracts, if there is one that you write with a provider, if it's private or public, it's something that you can back out of if it's not working. And so I think that's essential to making sure that you're getting the best system.
Does that address a little bit of what you're getting at? I have some familiarity with your general therapy model. And in my limited experience, I think that, many times it's an issue of people just don't know about the effectiveness of that, and it really takes an enlightened leader to listen, to incorporate those types of therapies into their program as, the PACE folks did. So part of this problem, I think, is the dissemination of information about these programs to demonstrate their effectiveness, that they really do work. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I want to thank all of you for being here. I really appreciate that. I have noticed that I do agree with a lot of what you say about the juveniles from their family history and maybe things they've been through in their life has caused so many emotional issues. So I guess my question is when you come across a juvenile that you see does have a mental illness and you refer that child to a mental health center, what kind of follow-up is involved in keeping track of that child, that juvenile, to make sure that they are receiving the proper help that they need, one, and not only the proper help, but just to keep up with them and make sure that they're not going through. I have a little brother that was referred to a mental health center, and he was sexually abused there. There was no follow-up or anything, and he's just off the wall as an adult now. So I guess, I'm concerned with what kind of follow-up and keeping track, yeah. Okay.
Judge, could you speak to that?
Well,
perhaps?
there's no doubt, and it was pretty evident to me as a juvenile judge, that we need to redirect a lot of our dollars, state dollars, not necessarily juvenile justice, into juvenile mental health facilities, because there are too many waiting lists, both for community care and community counseling, and certainly for the SIPS program, statewide psychiatric inpatient program. I mean, it's very hard to get a juvenile into those facilities, and it's very, very necessary and needed. And those kind of places, at the highest level, Devereaux and other places, have excellent treaters. It's just getting into them. And I'm sure those really good facilities do some kind of follow-up. And certainly a parent or guardian or even a probation officer should be looking for follow-up. But there's just a shortage of those facilities, most unfortunately.
I can say and maybe the juvenile probation officers who are here, we did probation supervision, conditional release, and probation supervision. And probably the trickiest part of it is the insurance. It's not about us not making the referrals oftentimes to who we think is a good provider or who we have documentation to show is a good provider. It's a lot of times about sustainability as far as the billing is concerned. And for instance, in Seminole County, we'll have a mental health program, but there'll only be maybe 10 slots for 480 some kids who are under supervision in Seminole County. And again, many of them do have some mental health issues that need to be addressed through longer than a 3-session, counseling. Part of the issue when we talked about the question from the other side of the room and what I talked about overall is that we can't do those things if we don't have some of that state money coming back to the local level to build those systems up. I mean, we can all want, we can all understand, we can all agree, but if we don't have the money, we don't have the program. If we don't have the program, I can't send your child there. And it really is difficult. I have a staff member who does nothing but help kids and their families apply for Medicaid. That's all she does. So that we can have some coverage and assistance for them with the billing of their therapy.
Hi.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Yes, sir.
Council Member Wingate Newton, City of St. Petersburg. Welcome. Hi, Judge, and thank you, Major. And thank you guys for having this forum. It's to the creed of what we're in battle with in St. Petersburg. The City of St. Petersburg contributes 150 to 165 juveniles to the Pinellas County juvenile system every month. We spend $10,000 to $20,000 doing that. Over 1,800 a year. And of that 1,800, 700 of them come from the schools, which we get paid $500,000 to put our police in those schools. Fresh back from Tallahassee, Senate Bill 2112, people have been talking about that. And also, we were lobbying for Senate Bill 882, which is supposed to get the standards in there for DJJ. And my question really are pretty simple. The passing of Senate Bill 221 without having any input from or any public hearings or very little public hearing and public input, isn't that equivalent to them closing down Dover, which is really bad for the juveniles, but giving the gatekeepers the same powers to do whatever they want throughout the state? And my second question also is, and this goes to after I sat down with DJJ and found out that they spoke to both sides, the Florida Sheriff's Association and I guess the governor's office, that they're pretty much staying out of it. But if they're in charge with the supervision of the juveniles in the system, why are the standards not mandated to at least look after those young people? And I applaud what you're doing with David, because I'm working with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and to have that kind of people there advising you is important, because that helps a lot. But no one, they won't even give us a hearing on these bills in Tallahassee because of the Florida Sheriff's Association, and also the $185 million they spend annually on beds. The lobbyists for that, they're not letting it see the light of day. So how do we get to laws that will help these young people? Because every law they pass have unintended circumstances. But if you don't have hearings on it to try to fix it, then it's the law.
You know, I'm not sure that your question is really answerable by us, but I'll just make an observation and then you all can chime in. You know, a lot of the progress that has been made comes from leadership. And unfortunately, we don't have enough people who are leaders who will step up and articulate a position and ask a question, because our system, the people deserve that kind of answer. So I don't know if others have a perspective, but I think, you know, we know from experience that things will not change unless folks speak up and are armed with information. And if they can talk about public safety and dollars, then they're going to get a receptive ear.
Can I just add something real quick to that? That's an excellent point. And the point I would make is the abuses that we saw in Texas in 2006 and some very serious facility issues that exist in other states exist even with state standards and state oversight. So that's not the answer. You know, that's not the way that we can ensure a good system exists, because even the people who are supposed to be doing the oversight of the state system, even they fall down on the job sometimes. The information that he just mentioned, that is the only way that we've seen a system really begin to exceed, is when we're looking at outcome data. You know, does a juvenile, after leaving a facility, do they go back to school? Are they going to go be employed? Are they going to college? Are they recidivating? That outcome data will tell us how that facility is doing. And that's what the state needs to focus on collecting. You know, standards are helpful sometimes, but they're not always the answer.
I just want to address a little bit.
I can tell you unequivocally, and I do appreciate what you guys are doing, when you have the lobbyists, the ones that receiving that $185 million for beds, and you have another, the Florida Sheriff's Association with access, because that's what money gets you, and then the common folk can't get access, those are how these laws get written. My state attorney, Mr. McCabe, told me, he says, Councilman, he said, all I got is the law. That's all I got. I'm a state attorney out there to enforce the law. Now, if you don't like the law, you need to go to Tallahassee and change the law. This is where this stuff is getting past that. These are the laws that they're using to torture these kids pretty much. And then for confinement, when you're saving money, but the mental impact that you put on these kids and you release them back in society, I mean, if you read the news, we had a huge shootout last night in my district. And the person driving the car was 17. Fired over 12 rounds into a limo. You know what I'm saying? I mean, and these young people, the question came up, well, how are they so mad? Well, when you get a record, because Florida's the only state that relinquishes juvenile records, and you can't get a job, you can't participate in the economic dream at a small age, yeah, you're going to be furious because you've been shut out at a very young age. That's why they're so mad. So opportunities to help them do better things and to use some of that money to do that is the answer, but there's no getting to it because the only people, I just left Tallahassee, that's getting access is the lobbyists for that 185 and the sheriffs. And because of that, no one will touch. Not even DJJ is even standing down. So who's going to...
Can I just say one thing about 2112, and then maybe we should move on? 2112 was born of years of frustration over detention cost reimbursement. Now, the application of 2112 certainly is open to a great deal of debate. However, had we had any reasonable conversations, and this was not just the sheriffs, this was mainly driven by the Florida counties because of the reconciliation on detention cost reimbursement and the 20 or so counties that were paying for the entire state. I think it was 27 counties were paying the cost of reimbursement for the entire state. I can tell you the last year that we paid, our per diem rate was $282 per day per child, and that's crazy. And if we can go to the Board of County Commissioners in Seminole County and say, we can do it for half that or a third of that, then that's why we in Seminole County wanted to do it. It wasn't to abuse children by any stretch of the imagination, and I would invite anybody in the audience to come to our detention center anytime you want, as long as you don't have a felony criminal history. But seriously, it was about we really did feel like we could do a better job, and statewide, the conversations on how they came to their rate was less than transparent. And that is because I was part of all of those meetings statewide, is where 2112 came from, a total breakdown in communication about reimbursement.
Okay, we have time for one quick question, and I want to respect your time. So this
if
will be the last
I
one.
may, I promised 4 people, so we'll make 4 quick questions.
Four
please.
quick questions. Okay, we're going to have 4 quick questions.
All right, I'll be quick. I've got a question and a sincere request from the major. How did Seminole County resist taking in Polk County's standards, which appear to be basically allowing abuse and torture of children? Next question, or next request is, while you're here in Pinellas County, could you please stop and talk to Sheriff Gualtieri? He's a good man, he's smart, and he knows a lot about jails, but he's hell-bent on following Grady Judd's party line. Thank you.
First of all, I can't and won't make any comments about Polk County or Sheriff Judd. I can tell you that we, and I think it's been alluded to tonight, which is we didn't see it as an opportunity to do anything but safely detain and, as much as possible, lower our detention capacity, or not capacity, but population. Prior to the Seminole County Sheriff's Office taking over, our daily average was somewhere between 40 and 50 youth. Our daily average now is 15. Because of local control, again, we have a lot of options on detention avoidance. And I would be, probably not tonight, but happy to talk to your sheriff. I don't know that it would be with the intent to dissuade him from doing anything with Polk County other than to show him the model that we have in Seminole County.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I go to St. Leo University. I'm a psychology major there, criminal justice minor. And I recently have written a paper on the recidivism of juveniles and the life without parole. I've done like over 3 months worth of research, read everything I could find, and I see both sides of where juveniles are coming from. My father is a police officer in Sarasota County and arrests people every day. And I also have been in and out of rehab before, and it helps. Therapy helps people, and I just don't understand why inside the incarceration facilities, There's no therapy. Why can't we bring therapy to the people who are in jail? You say these juveniles are angry, aggressive, mad. Well, everybody gets mad. Everyone gets aggressive. Why can't we bring therapists inside there to talk to those juveniles to lower their aggression, lower their anger? My father tells me all the time that we have no money in the system for that. We have nothing for that. But how are the juveniles going to get better? How are they going to not reoffend if they have nobody to talk to, no outlet, if you don't give them one?
It's a great question. I appreciate it. And the only thing that I can add to what you're saying is that unfortunately, some of the things that we actually do that are not rehabilitating people, again, like solitary confinement, are actually kind of expensive. You know, on average, solitary confinement costs 2 to 3 times more than normal confinement would. And so, I mean, if some of that money was taken away from sort of creating single cells for single occupants and put into other places, you know, that might lead to some of the productive solutions you're talking about.
Joe?
Yes.
Yeah, and I would add to that most juvenile commitment facilities do have therapy of some sort in it, but the really effective therapy is when the family is involved. Right from the beginning, from the day the child is committed, there should be a plan with the family involved, either in person once a week, or if they live in a faraway place, by Skype or something, or telephone, because what happens is when the juvenile progresses with good therapy and then has to go back to the same family situation and neighborhood or temptations, you know, everything that was done well in therapy is for naught. So that's the kind of therapy that should take place.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to say I appreciate the opportunity to ask this question. What are your thoughts on victim offender mediation programs in relation to decreased juvenile recidivism rates, as well as are there victim offender reconciliation programs as part of the Pinellas or the Seminole County juvenile justice system?
Can either of you speak to that? The question is,
was that mediation?
Victim.
Yeah, I think I'd let the judge go first
victim
on
reconciliation
Okay.
plans. Yeah.
That's kind of a restorative justice
Right.
concept, and we tried to start some things like that when I was a judge. I'm not aware of what's been done in the last 2 years since, to get communities through their churches, like in South St. Pete, things like that, to have victims meet with the perpetrators and their family and design a kind of restorative justice payback, rather than having payback money, you know, cut their lawn, something like that, or something that would help the victim, please the victim too. That's a very good concept, and it's done in a lot of other places. I don't think we've fully developed it here yet. Councilman Newton is here. Maybe he has some ideas on that he can take back to St. Pete.
I know that it is done, you're right, Judge, in some other counties. I think it's kind of spotty, and because it is not consistent, there's not a whole lot of data that you can immediately draw on to say, hey, maybe we ought to be doing more of this elsewhere. But I know the concept is fairly widespread.
I just would add that the research that we've seen shows that victim offender mediation for juveniles can reduce recidivism. The average reduction is around 7%. But what's most effective are counties and states that have implemented victim offender mediation as a function of either the prosecutor or law enforcement. New Jersey has a program where law enforcement can refer a juvenile to victim offender mediation before formal charges are even filed. So they know best about the types of cases and the types of juveniles and the types of victims that would be most amenable to this kind of system. Texas has worked more on the prosecutor side of things, where they're allowed to refer the cases to victim offender mediation. And that's really kind of an integral part of a successful program.
Here's our last question.
Good evening. My name is Rick Davison, and thank you, Major. I'm very familiar with Seminole County, and Judge Sullivan, very pleased to see you again. I've actually read your book, Raised by the Courts, and it's like it's reality on the pages. And as far as I can answer a question about restorative justice, one, there are only 3 active restorative justice programs in the state of Florida, 1 in Tallahassee, 1 in Gainesville, and 1 in Orlando. Unfortunately, it's a concept that has not taken hold. There is a fellow by the name of Dr. Gordon Bazemore out of Florida Atlantic University, who is a national figure as it relates to restorative justice. And in fact, there was a restorative justice conference that was held in Tallahassee on February 20th. I could get you that material if I could talk with you afterwards. I guess a couple questions, and one is I'm just looking around the room and wondering where or if there are Department of Juvenile Justice people here, because those are the folks that we should be talking to. I attended a couple of the, I guess they call them neighborhood outreach or whatever it was.
Roadmap meetings?
The roadmap meetings. Yeah. And unfortunately what I found that there were usually department people in the audience, but were pretty mum and weren't saying a whole lot, unfortunately. But my question goes specifically with St. Petersburg area. And in 2010, the Schott Foundation issued a report on the graduation rates of black males. And in Pinellas County, it showed that black males graduated at 21%. That's 21%, which means 79% that are not graduating. And just wondering from the panel, you know, if kids are not in school, or if they're suspended, or if they're not graduating, what's happening with them? Where are they? The fact of the matter is, in 1994, when the Department of Juvenile Justice was initially started, they had a budget of about $600 million. That budget has been reduced to about $400 million in the ensuing years. But the fact of the matter is, the need has not decreased. And just wondering, from the standpoint of the professionals up there, if you guys can tell us how we can redirect some of that money back. And the last thing I'll say for the Seminole County Sheriff's Office, and this is not a slight on your agency, but we have to keep in mind that detention is a dangerous place, and in fact, youth die there. You can ask Omar Paisley out of Miami-Dade. Or if you're not familiar with the history, sometimes you're doomed to repeat it, and I'm now talking about from the boot camp standpoint, and you can ask Martin Lee Anderson, you know, we can't go without structure that's coming from either the state or the department or some other regulation, where sheriff's office are great places, and I will tell you personally, I work for one. But when you go without rules to follow, then you often end up with situations like what occurred in Bay County, and which ultimately led to the closing of all the boot camps because there was a sheriff's office operating without any statewide standards that they were required to follow.
I don't know if any of us have a perspective on what an expert perspective on what the situation is with the graduation rates in Pinellas County, except those of us who live here or nearby are aware of that issue. And I would say...
I am a little bit.
Okay, maybe you can talk to the school board judge.
That's a shocking statistic, and it's accurate. Ward Kennedy with the Pinellas County School Board has just started a task force to help keep more of those kids in school, because that's the problem. They don't go to school until they're 16 every day and then just drop out. You know, they start dropping out at 12, 13, 14. And unfortunately, if they're in middle school still at 15, and then they get to high school at 16, they find out that they, with their parents' permission, you know, they can drop out. They pressure the parent and they drop out. Or even if they're in school at 14 and they get to school at 15, they know in 1 year I can drop out. And it does happen with African American males more than any other population. So join that task force. That might be a help, but we need to figure out a way to keep them engaged in school.
And you underscore a huge problem, because the largest group of, quote, youth at risk in the country today, and indeed in Florida as well, is an age group 14 through 24 who are neither in school nor working nor being trained to work. So to your question, what are they doing? Not much good. So we're out of time, but I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank our panel for their participation tonight. And now I'd like to call back David Clement to make a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Clark, and great job of moderating, if I may say so, as a former one myself. May I ask for another round of applause for the moderator and the panel? It has been a good discussion. I do feel we could go longer, but I know we also want to respect your time and let you go. I do want to tell you a little bit about our next panel. We don't have a date set yet. It will be sometime after the legislature's current session, as reference was made to legislation that is hoped for in this current session. In our next session, we'll assess what the legislature did, if anything, in this subject, and we will start to try to sum up some of the things we've learned in the 2 sessions so far about this topic. I want to also remind you that the next program of the Village Square will be on May 22nd. We don't have the topic yet, but it's one that you won't want to miss. Again, thank you for coming, and good night, safe trip home.